Bon, on va commencer. Je vais faire la présentation en français et la soutenance sera en anglais, je crois. Donc, nous sommes réunis pour la soutenance de thèse de doctorat donc, de Corentin Jeudy. Donc, soutenance qui a été autorisée après avis des rapporteurs Olivier Blasi, professeur à l'École polytechnique, Vadim Iblachevski, chercheur à IBM Zurich. Le jury est composé de Alice Pelé-Marie, chargée de recherche à Bordeaux, l'encadrement était assuré par Pierre-Alain Fouque, professeur à l'Université de Rennes, Adeline Roux-Langlois, directrice de recherche à l'Université de Caen, Olivier Sanders, ingénieur de recherche, et donc j'ai l'honneur de présider ce jury. Je suis Damien Vergniaud, professeur à Sorbonne Université. Et donc, Corentin, tu as 45 minutes pour nous présenter tes travaux et ensuite on te posera des questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited to share with you my doctoral work, which was supervised by Pierre-Alain Fouque, Adeline Roux-Langlois, and Olivier Sanders, on the design of advanced post-quantum signature schemes. So let me first begin this presentation by breaking this title down so that we can understand and grasp the stakes of this work as well as the context behind it. The main subject of this title is signature. We all know what a written signature is. It is used to acknowledge the validity of some information or the identity of someone. And we have to sign plenty of things in our everyday lives, and sometimes we're not allowed to do so, and we have to have information signed by someone else, say a government attesting your citizenship. So you fill out a form, provide necessary documentation to your government so that they can issue a passport attesting your identity as a citizen. You can later show this passport or signature, which contains your personal information, to different individuals who we call verifiers, as they will verify the validity of what you're claiming. And they can be your local bank teller, doctor, border control agents, and whatnot. But this works for real-life interactions. In the digital world, we want to preserve the same functionalities and guarantees, but in a digital way, which is why we resort to digital signatures. And your passport actually already contains one, which is what you scan at the airport. So we abstract away these individuals of signer and verifiers, as they can be a wide range of digital entities, from simple airport scanners to digital identity providers. But the workflows stay exactly the same. The user sends the data it wants certified to the signer, who is the only one competent to deliver a signature. Then the user can send the signature along with the actual data to the verifiers so that they can check the signature is valid for the data they provided. And this allows us to certify any digital information while later proving its authenticity. So it seems there's nothing left to do, right? Well, to convince you why this is not exactly true, let me take the example of age control. Assume we have a user who got issued a passport by their government and wants to prove to a merchant that they're an adult, say to buy lottery tickets or any other age-restricted product. To do so, they would simply show their passport as it contains their birth date. But because they only show it temporarily, we can also safely assume that the merchant is not going to remember all the extra information that appears on the document, like their name, address, photographs, and so on. But if we want to test the same thing to a website, say to watch age-restricted YouTube content, for example, it's going to require a proof of our digital identity and personal information. And here, a standard digital signature would do it, but to be verified, it requires the data it certifies, which is why they're asking for a copy of your passport or even credit card information sometimes. And here, this is a whole other problem, because once you send this information, you no longer have control over what they will do with it, and it means you trust them enough not to share or exploit your data, all that just to prove that you're of age. Also, we need to be worried about outsiders who might intercept this information and use it later to, say, mount phishing campaigns, identity theft, fraud, or something along those lines. So we have two very distinct problems between the physical and digital world, but we use the exact same solution, which yields a huge privacy problem. Back to our previous picture, we can see that it is not suited for the privacy of the user because their private data has to be made publicly available for the verifiers to check the signature. It means they have no control over their private data. So let's see if we can change this picture a little bit to preserve the same signature functionality that we desire, but in combination with privacy features. First, in the issuance phase, the user can instead send the data in a hiding envelope that even the signer cannot open. But this envelope should be special enough so that the signer can still produce a partial signature on the data inside it, a little bit like carbon paper, but also with the assurance that what's inside it is some legitimate piece of information. Then, to show the signature, the user can instead generate a proof that they know a valid signature on their data, but in such a way that the proof itself cannot be falsified and does not leak any relevant information about the data or the signature. These are called zero-knowledge proof. But now the user has again total control over what they decide to hide or disclose, thus addressing her privacy concerns. But it also requires more complex tools like this hiding envelope, the specific signature that signs through the envelope, and those zero-knowledge proofs. This general blueprint is generally referred to as signature with efficient protocols, and I'm going to use SCP for short for the rest of the presentation. Okay, so assuming we can construct such SCP schemes, it can lead to the design of many technical solutions that would address most of our privacy use cases. The reason for that is because in those use cases, we need some kind of signature issuance and some kind of anonymity. The one use case that I described in the previous slides is what we call anonymous credentials, which is an umbrella term that encompasses many privacy-oriented identification mechanisms. But we can also mention group signatures, e-cache systems, enhanced privacy identifications, and so on. In particular, those enhanced privacy identification, EPID, or direct anonymous attestation, DAA, are crucial in the security of industrial systems like TPMs or Intel SGX, for example. And solutions for those already exist in standards like ISO and are currently deployed in billions of devices and chips all around the world, even in our personal computers. Now, although this is not the only way, SCPs provide a very versatile way of designing all of these primitives from the same building blocks, which is why the main thread of this thesis is directed towards those SCPs and their versatility. But how do we construct these SCP schemes and all those systems using maths and cryptography? Well, here we fall in the category of public key cryptography, which means we have a key that is public, made available to anyone, especially the verifiers, and a key that is secret and held only by the signer to generate signatures. And the security of currently deployed systems relies on the harness of two problems mostly, which is factoring a product of large primes into P and Q, or solving the discrete logarithm, which is to find x given g and g to the x. And these systems work, they're reasonably fast, and they're secure based on the harness of these two problems. Well, they're secure, but not in a quantum world. With the emergence of quantum computing, we have to account for new computing methods that could solve what we weren't able to before. And this unfortunately encompasses those factoring and discrete logarithm problem due to Shor's algorithm from 1994. To protect against attackers using such quantum computers, we thus have to find new mathematical tools and problems that would be hard to solve even quantumly so that we can build cryptography upon. This area is called post-quantum cryptography, and there are several theoretical directions to achieve that, but the one we focus on is called lattice theory. Lattices not only seem to be a reliable and efficient way of designing signatures, as the recent NIST competition has proven, but they also seem to be the most promising ones where we can design those zero-knowledge proofs in an efficient way for our privacy protocols. And this will be the starting point for the rest of the presentation. I will first give a few background notions on lattices, including the assumptions that will be our security foundation, as well as some fundamental tools that we're going to need in our designs. Then I decided to present 3 of my contributions, and I'll mention some other ones at the very end of the presentation. First, as standard signature schemes are an essential part of designing SCP schemes, we'll first look at the design of a standard signature called Phoenix. Then I will move on to designing those signatures for privacy purposes, following the main thread of versatility and practicality. And in particular, we will see how we can draw lessons from the design of standard signature schemes like Phoenix in the construction of SCPs. Okay, so let's start with a few preliminary notions on lattices. First of all, what is a lattice? A lattice is essentially a periodic grid of points in n dimensions, but it can be more compactly described by a basis B as a set of all integer linear combinations of those basis vectors. On the right-hand side here, you have an example of a 2-dimensional lattice with 2 possible bases in blue and orange, and depending on which basis you're given, it is going to dictate the difficulty of the lattice problems that will be our security foundation. One such problem is the closest vector problem, or CVP for short. And it can be stated like this. I give you a target x0 in the space, and I ask you to find the closest lattice point, which is the x1 that minimizes the distance to x0. And in 2 dimensions, this seems fairly easy, but when you go to hundreds of dimensions, this becomes extremely hard, even for quantum computers. The remaining unknown here is what lattice do we work on? Well, in cryptography, we're mostly interested in families of lattices which are parameterized with a matrix A as the set of all x1s that verify A times x1 equals 0 mod q. And if you consider CVP on this kind of lattice, with x0 set as the equation at the bottom, then this is called the ISIS problem for inhomogeneous short integer solution problem. But ISIS is also more usually defined like this. I give you a uniform matrix A mod q and a uniform vector u, also mod q, and I ask you to find a short vector x that verifies A times x equals u mod q. We also have a homogeneous version of the problem when u equals to 0, where we further ask that x should be non-zero, otherwise the problem becomes trivial. And in cryptography, we're also very interested in decision problems for security proofs, and we can define a decision version of ISIS, which is to distinguish between a vector of the form A times x mod q for random short x from a perfectly random vector u mod q. And for this decision problem, we have 2 parameter regimes. We first have the statistical regime where the hardness is unconditional based on the leftover hash lemma, but this usually results in larger parameters and less efficient schemes. So we would like to prefer a computational hardness regime, in which case we give a name to this decision ISIS problem, which is called now the learning with errors problem, or LWE. These problems are hard, and even both classically and quantumly, and they are the security foundation for all our designs. Well, they're hard unless we know a secret piece of information known as trapdoor R on the matrix A. This trapdoor essentially allows us to solve ISIS, which is to invert the function that maps x to ax mod q over a bounded domain, meaning over short vectors x. But more than that, it gives us the ability to randomize this preimage finding method without leaking our secret knowledge of R. And this is called preimage sampling. Now, based on a preimage sampling procedure, we can directly design secure signature scheme following the framework by Gentry, Pykern, and Vaikuthanathan from 2008. And it works as follows. You first hash the message that you want to sign into a vector u, and you use your preimage sampling procedure to find a short random x that verifies this equation, and you output this as your signature. Okay, but there are several ways of defining those trapdoors and preimage samplers, so how do we choose? Well, remember that the main thread here is versatility. So we're going to choose the most versatile framework that we know of, and this is one due to Michancho and Parkert from 2012 based on gadgets. So how does it work? In their paper, they define a family of matrices, A bar, which are of the following form. The first block is a matrix A, which can even be further decomposed as the identity matrix and a matrix A prime. And the second block is some Tg minus A times R. R is our trapdoor matrix composed of short elements, and the product A times R can actually be made public under the hardness of ISIS and decision ISIS. Then we have T, which is called the tag matrix, but it's usually just a scalar times the identity matrix. And the key component here is G, which is called the gadget matrix. And in our case, it is just the base B recomposition matrix that essentially allows us through inversion to invert any element mod Q, okay? Now, how do we construct short preimages for matrices of this form? Well, we first sample a vector Z that is short and that verifies TGZ equals U mod Q, say using the base B decomposition, and then we return R prime Z as our preimage of U, where R prime Z is RZ for the top component and Z for the bottom one. The problem with this approach is that collecting many preimages will leak some information on R, which we don't want for security. And I'm going to go back to that in the next slide. So to counter that, we perturb those preimages and add a mask P to them. And we also need to update the gadget inversion to be on u minus a bar p instead of just u to keep the correct equations in the end. Okay, now the question is, how do we choose this mask? Well, in the original paper, the authors provided a convolution method. The idea is that if you sample z from a Gaussian distribution, also such that tgz equals u, then r prime z will also be a Gaussian distribution, but whose covariance depends on r. And this is why we have a problem for security if we just output this, because I can mount statistical attack to recover the covariance and recover r. So to avoid that, I will sample p from another Gaussian distribution, but whose covariance will cancel out this dependency so that I end up with a spherical Gaussian, meaning it's the same width in all directions, but most importantly, whose width does not depend on r anymore, thus preserving security. This approach is fairly compact, but it requires a lot of complexities about those Gaussian sampler to sample z such that tgz equals u, and also to sample p from this highly skewed distribution. The second method that I want to provide is called rejection sampling. And for that, we need to understand what we want to hide. We want to hide r, which appears as rz in the top component, which is the shift we want to hide. Unfortunately, z also appears in the bottom component, which leaks some information on this shift. And this is why in the convolution method, we had to perturb both parts and we couldn't set p2 equals to 0. Well, actually, if we really want to, we can. And this was the approach chosen by Lubashevsky and Wicks in 2015 by setting p2 equals to 0, setting z to be the gadget inversion of u minus ap1, and then rejecting every time it leads to a statistical leakage, and if we reject, we start over until we don't have any leakage anymore. This approach is very interesting in the sense that it's very versatile and can be instantiated with very different distribution and not just Gaussians. So you can use, for example, a uniform distribution, like at the bottom, you sample P1, you shift it by a small amount RZ, and then you reject all of the red area, which corresponds to statistical leakage. There is one slight caveat, though. The caveat is that if we set Z that way, it's likely going to depend on P1, which we don't want, as it will thwart the whole security argument based on rejection sampling. So to smooth out this dependency, we required U minus AP1 to be statistically uniform. And in their paper, because they assume that U is arbitrary, meaning we cannot extrapolate any properties from it, then this statistical regularity of U minus AP1 falls onto AP1, which negatively impacts the parameters and the performance of the sampler. And this will actually be our starting point for our first contribution, which is the design of a signature scheme called Phoenix. This was a joint work with Adeline Roulanglois and Olivier Sanders, which I presented at PQ Crypto last week. Okay, so our first observation is that if we require AP1 being statistically uniform, then it degrades performance. Why? Well, because if we use, say, the leftover hash lemma, it's going to require P1 to have a high entropy. And having a high entropy can be achieved in two ways here, either by having a high dimensional vector with a low variance, like a narrow Gaussian distribution, for example, or on the opposite, having a low dimensional vector with a large variance. But either way, it negatively impacts the parameters and makes the preimage quite big. Our idea and observation was that in certain contexts, we can assume something about the syndrome and we can salvage some of its entropy to avoid this regularity argument on AP1. In particular, in the context of signature schemes, say by using U, the hash of the message, as I presented at the beginning, then we don't need this high entropy for P1, which means we can have a low dimensional vector with a low variance at the same time. It leads to more compact parameters and also smaller preimages. So this is what the sampler looks like, which is the exact same thing from the 2015 sampler, but we have parameter conditions that make it more efficient. So you sample P1 from this source distribution, you invert U minus AP1 to get V2, construct P1 plus RV2 and reject every time you have a statistical leakage, and otherwise you output V, which satisfies the correct equation. So it's fairly nice. We managed to improve on the preimage size in a specific context, but can we go even further? Well, the answer is yes, because in this context of non-arbitrary syndromes, we can actually try and combine this rejection sampler with the approximate trapdoor approach from Chen, Genizet, Mukherjee. This idea is that instead of finding a short v such that a bar v equals u, it's sufficient to find a short v prime such that a bar v prime equals u up to a small error e. And as long as this error is small enough, we preserve the security guarantees, but with a much smaller signature v prime. And in the context of Michanchar and Piker trapdoors, their idea was to say, well, we can sample v prime using only the high order components of the gadget, and the low order components, which is going to result in a small error term, are going to define our error. So this is the rejection sampler that we had, and we change it in the following way to obtain the approximate rejection sampler. So instead of taking the full base B decomposition, we only take the high order components, and the low order components are going to define our error. Now, because A bar has the identity in the first block, we can actually merge this error E to the first part of V1 so that we still have a vector V that satisfies the exact equation, but with a slightly larger V1. The question now is, how larger? Well, in our case, the preimage error can be bounded by b to the L minus 1 and is roughly uniform. In particular, it is smaller than in the original paper of CGM19, which relied on the convolution method and as such Gaussian distributions, which were a little bit larger. In turn, it allows us to drop more entries of the gadget to have a more compact scheme, and we can even go up to L equals k minus 1, in which case GH is just b to the k minus 1 times the identity matrix. Nevertheless, this error is still slightly larger than with the semi-random sampler of Yu, Jie, and Wang introduced at Crypto last year, but we have a much smaller V2, and this will be a key component in the design of Phoenix. Okay, so this is it for the sampling part. Now let's see how we can use this sampler to obtain a signature scheme. Well, if you remember, as long as I have Michanchar-Piker trapdoors or any kind of trapdoor and a sampler, like the approximate rejection sampler, I can plug that into the framework of Gentry, Piker, Nathan, where I invert just U is the hash of the message, and I get a secure signature scheme. And in that case, we end up with a signature scheme which is called Flamenco. The reason why it is not Phoenix yet is because, yes, we have short signatures, but we also have fairly large public keys. So can we reduce the public key size to obtain a more decent signature scheme? Well, you guessed it. Once again, the answer is yes. By using a similar approach to the approximate trapdoor setting, we can split the public key matrix B into the low order bits BL and the high order bits BH. And we now want to rewrite this verification equation so that it's only a function of BH. And in turn, it means that we don't need to transmit BL to the verifiers, thus compressing the public key. Okay, so we split B that way. We rewrite this equation, which makes this BLV2 term up here, which is a short compression error. The reason it is short is because BL is some low order bits, so it's short by nature, and V2 is particularly short because of our approximate rejection sampler. Remember that V2 is some high order base B decomposition of something, so in particular its coefficients are bounded by B minus 1. And in our case, we also show that the optimal base is B equals 2, which means that V2 is actually ternary. And this makes this compression error very small. Now we can merge this compression error to the first part of V1, just like we did for the sampling error. And now we need to have a little discussion on how much bits of the public key we can cut. Well, as long as we choose L prime so that this compression error stays below the sampling error, it means that V1, the first part of V1, will not increase by that much, which means we keep the same level of security, but for a more compact public key. So our compression comes almost for free. And in our case, we show that we can drop half of the public key while having a compression error that stays below the sampling error, and this is due to our very short V2. In particular, I also want to mention that our key compression does not need to rely on extra hints or rejection sampling steps that are usually necessary for other key compression methods for both correctness and security. And this is Phoenix. This is Flamingo with key compression. Now, how does Phoenix places itself in the landscape of lattice signatures? At the moment, we have two main signature paradigms, which are hash and sign following the GPV framework, and fiat-chamier with the boards. And we have a representative for each of those, which have been chosen for standardization by NIST, with namely Falcon and Dilithium. And they're kind of on both ends of the spectrum between size and scheme complexity, in the sense that Falcon has relatively short sizes, but is also a fairly complex scheme, while on the opposite, Dilithium is much simpler, but also has slightly larger sizes. There have been improvements of these two schemes, which are currently under evaluations, with Solmae, which is a simpler version of Falcon, but with similar sizes, and Hete, which increases the scheme complexity of Dilithium, but also significantly reduces the size. Nevertheless, there still seems to be a fair distinction between fiat-chamier with the board signatures and hash and sign signatures. And this is where Phoenix comes into the picture by kind of bridging both signature paradigms into what we call hash and sign with the boards. To be fair, Phoenix is still a hash and sign scheme, but it draws some of the nice features of fiat-chamier with the board signatures. In particular, it can be instantiated with a wide variety of distribution thanks to the rejection sampler, and it's also much easier to implement than previous hash and sign schemes. And it also inherits from the benefits of hash and sign schemes in the sense that it has a tighter security in the quantum random oracle model compared to fiat-chamier with the board signatures. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, we also have, due to the specificity of our sampler, a very easy way of performing key compression. Okay, so this is all I wanted to present for Phoenix. Now, let's see if we can use Phoenix in the context of signatures privacy. This part is based on two joint works, one of which was presented at the last year, and the other one which was recently accepted to be presented in October at CCS. Okay, remember what we want to achieve. We have a user who sends a hiding envelope to the signer and gets back a partial signature. And then they want to prove the the verification equation of the signature is zero knowledge to send back to the verifier. Okay, so let's start with Phoenix. This is actually the uncompressed version, so it's actually Flamingo. And we have R, which is our secret trapdoor matrix. The product A times R is our public key. V is the signature, which is drawn from the approximate rejection sampler. And we invert the hash of the message. Okay? Now, if we want to plug that into a zero knowledge proof while hiding the message, because this is our personal information, we're going to have to prove that this hash has been properly evaluated. And because hash functions are so complex, this usually is really impractical to prove, resulting in very inefficient proofs. So if at all possible, we would like to avoid hash functions on secret data, which kind of discards this Phoenix approach, but also more generally the GPV approach, and also schemes like the lithium and Hete. Now, if we discard hash functions on the message, where do we put the message? Well, I want to present two ways which have been provided in the literature. First, we can use the tag of the approximate mid-central trapdoor, to embed the message. This was, for example, the approach used in the group signature by Delpino, Lubishevsky, and Seller from 2018, where they used the tag to be just a message. But in that case, it requires to have either a small message space, which is fine in the context of static group signatures, but not so much in more general cases like anonymous credentials, or it requires us to weaken the security model to go to a selective security. And I'm going to go back on that in a few slides. This was also the approach chosen by Delpino and Katsumata in their blind signatures. In their case, they used the tag to be just the hash of the message. So again, we fall on the caveat to have hash functions on secret data. So not entirely satisfactory. The second approach that I want to present was actually anterior to that, from 2016 by Libera and co-authors. And their idea was to deal with arbitrary messages by using a cryptographic commitment scheme, D0R plus D1M. This D0R plays the hiding part. The problem with their scheme is that based on their design choices and security proofs, they had to have all of these extra complexities in the scheme, like having to embed a trapdoor in the first matrix D0, which made the signature and zero-knowledge proofs larger, taking this binary decomposition, which also made the zero-knowledge proofs larger, and in the end, it resulted in a very inefficient scheme. Our optimistic estimates of this scheme led to proof sizes of about 700 megabytes, which is not practical at all to be used in security systems. Our approach was to kind of combine the best of both approaches. To deal with arbitrary messages, we reused this idea of cryptographic commitment scheme, but we reviewed the security proof and the design choices to avoid having to embed a secret trapdoor in the first matrix, which means we can reuse the same matrix A from the other side. What this allows us to do is to merge this randomness part to the first part of V, the signature, which reduces the size of the signature, and also means that we have one fewer vector to prove knowledge of, which makes the zero-knowledge proof smaller. And to still keep a strong security based on an adaptive security model and standard assumptions like SIS, we use a tag and a vector U to make the security proof work, but that are independent of the message this time. There is still one caveat, which is mentioned on the slide, is that the syndrome we invert with our sampler must now be treated as arbitrary, which means that our whole observation on the approximate rejection sampler no longer holds, and we need to go back to the convolution sampler. But nevertheless, we end up with a signature that is versatile, can be derived in many subsequent primitives, that stays on an adaptive security model and standard assumptions. And through this whole chain of changes, it also shows that there are many constraints to be met to design signatures with efficient protocols. In particular, improving the signature in a vacuum is not sufficient to have efficient SCP schemes. We need to take a much more global approach and find the synergies between the commitment scheme, the signature scheme, and the zero-knowledge proof systems. This is the construction that we presented at Crypto. The last question about this construction is, how efficient is it? Well, compared to the previous 2016 construction, which was the only post-quantum SCP before our work, we are several orders of magnitudes more efficient, but it's still not yet practical enough. We have signatures of about 300 kilobytes and proof sizes of about 650 kilobytes, which is not practical enough. So how do we optimize that? In this thesis, there are several works which have attempted at doing so in different ways in the context of anonymous credentials. The first one, by Lai and co-authors, was to relax the security model and go to a selective security. Selective security means that the adversary tells you in advance what message they will produce a forgery on. And by weakening the security model, they'll still manage to gain a factor of 3 on those sizes. The second approach by Boutel and co-authors was to instead relax the security assumptions. Instead of relying on SIS and LWE, they introduced a new assumption called untrue ISISF and its interactive version, which allowed them to go down to 3.5 kilobytes for the signature and 62 kilobytes for the proof size. But this is also at the expense of a new assumption, which is not as well studied. And the final approach was by Blasi and co-authors, which was to optimize for implementation, meaning the concrete running times of the system. But in that case, it also resulted in larger proof sizes, which we would like to avoid. So let me rephrase. How can we optimize those sizes and timings while keeping a strong and well-studied security? For that, we need to dive in a little bit more in the security proof of our system. Our security proof works in 2 steps. The first step is to change the public key matrix from AR to AR plus T star G, where T star is a guess that we make on the tag that will be included in the forgery by the adversary. This is the first step. Then the second step is to use the forgery to solve an SIS instance. And by contraposition, if SIS is hard, then it means that the forgery was infeasible in the first place. So let's look at the second step first. We received our forgery T star V star on the message M star. And if we set B in that way and U and D with a hidden relation, then we can factor out the matrix A from this whole equation to have A times a short vector equals 0 mod Q, which is exactly solving SIS. Okay? So the second step is taken care of. Now let's look at the first one. In the first step, we go through a series of changes. We start with A times R, where we have a trapdoor. Then we change it to be a uniform matrix, but under the harness of decision ISIS, this is unbeknownst to the adversary. Then we can add T star G without changing the distribution. And then we go back to AR plus T star G, where we have a trapdoor everywhere except for the tag T star. The problem comes in this middle section, because here we don't have a trapdoor, so we cannot produce preimages, we cannot answer signing queries. And in particular, we also don't have hashes, which means we don't have the freedom of the random oracle model to do the same thing. So we have to deal with this problem somehow. The approach that we chose for our crypto paper was to rely on the statistical argument, which is to say that we don't even need to go through this middle section. We can just say that both ends are directly statistically indistinguishable. But this results in larger parameters and less efficient sizes, which are the ones that I presented before. So we would prefer to use a computational argument based, say, on the LWE assumption. But in this case, we need to go through this middle section and we need to deal with this problem. The solution that was provided in the literature was to extend the matrix to embed a second trapdoor slot, G minus AR prime, so that when B is uniform, we still can use R prime to produce preimages and answer signing queries. But this is still slightly unsatisfactory in two ways. First, it extends the matrix by quite a large amount, KD columns, which means we're going to have larger preimages, larger signatures, and larger proof sizes. The second reason why it is not entirely satisfactory is because we don't actually know if this is necessary for the security of the system or if it's just to make the security proof work. We don't have a clear answer on that second question, but we can make this approach much more efficient. The idea is to, instead of changing the entire key in one row, we're going to change it progressively by each blocks of size k, so that we only need a partial trapdoor slot of k columns. So how does it work? We split B in chunks of size k and assume that we already changed the first I-1 blocks to embed this T star term, and the I+1 to D blocks as they were at the beginning, where we have a trapdoor everywhere. And we now want to embed T star in the ice component, so we change it to be a uniform column block. And now we cannot invert this component anymore. So we need a way to invert this component. And this is done by using a partial trapdoor slot, GI minus AR prime I, which is only k columns instead of KD. So we have smaller preimages, smaller signatures, and smaller proof sizes at the same time. The second optimization we can bring to our system is to rely on elliptical Gaussians instead of spherical. Remember when I presented the convolution method, I said for spherical Gaussian, which was the same width in all directions. But if we look at the naive way of sampling preimages, which is RZ for the top component and Z for the bottom component does not depend on R. So intuitively, we would like to perturb it less than the first component. And by aiming for an elliptical Gaussian, we can have a smaller width for the directions that do not depend on R and save essentially a factor which is the norm of R. This results in smaller preimages, smaller signatures, and smaller proof sizes again. Now, along with some further optimizations, it led us to have a scheme which is much more efficient than our previous attempt, with signature sizes of around 7 kilobytes and proof sizes of about 80 kilobytes. But can we go a little bit further in the proof size and have quick optimizations? Well, again, the answer is yes. By using some known tricks on the zero-knowledge proofs, we can actually get the size down to 61 kilobytes while staying on standard assumptions. The reason why we didn't include those was mostly because it required more care and implementation. But now we have a scheme that has very interesting sizes, that stays on an adaptive security model, and that relies on standard assumptions. The last thing to take is, what about the timings? Well, for that, we provided a full-fledged implementation of our scheme in the context of anonymous credentials, and in particular, we implemented those zero-knowledge proofs for our protocols. So let's look at those findings. First, for the issuance phase, the user can commit to the message by AR plus DM, and they also want to prove that this commitment is well-formed, so that the signer does not sign any random garbage. And this is actually the most computationally intensive part, which takes about 200 milliseconds. Then the signer can verify the proof in half the time, generate the partial signature, and the user can complete the signature by merging R to the first part of V. And all of that brings us to a total of less than half a second, which should be imperceptible in most use cases. So we have a fairly practical issuance. Now let's look at the second protocol, which is the authentication. Here, the user just has to generate a proof that the verification equation of the signature goes through, and this can be done in about 350 milliseconds, and the verifier can verify that in half the time, bringing us to a total of about half a second, which is already 4 times faster than the only implementation by Blasi and co-authors. So we also have a fairly practical authentication. In the end, we have a scheme or a framework that leads to very practical signatures that are versatile to design many different use cases and primitives, that is practical and that stays on a strong security base. And this is all I wanted to present about my contribution. So let me now conclude on what we've discussed today and on a few open perspectives. What we covered today was mostly point 2 to 4, but in this thesis, I also looked at the foundation level by analyzing the LWE assumption in a variety of settings. Then, in the tool and signatures part, we opened this black box of preimage samplers to find optimizations, which led to the approximate rejection sampler. And due to the specificity of this sampler, it allowed us to construct a fairly interesting signature scheme, which we called Phoenix. Then, for the advanced signatures, we provided a framework for efficient signatures for privacy, following the thread of versatility to be able to have many different use cases covered. And we also showcased practicality by providing an implementation in the context of anonymous credentials, which also required us to implement the zero-knowledge proofs. Now, to conclude on a few open perspectives, on the foundation level, I think one of the main directions at the moment is to keep formulating and studying new assumptions, as we've seen that they could make the schemes more efficient. But it requires care in studying and cryptanalysis for us to have confidence in those assumptions. For the sampling part, a big open question at the moment is to have an analysis of approximate samplers when the syndrome we invert is arbitrary. We've seen that we couldn't use our approximate rejection sampler for our SEP scheme because of that. So having an analysis that works could allow us to reduce the gadget, reduce the size of the signature, the public key, and the zero-knowledge proof all at the same time. So this could unlock efficiency gains here. Then, for Phoenix, we see that it can be instantiated with a wide variety of distributions. So the next step will be to find distributions that keep the same level of compactness while being easy to sample and that have an easy to protect rejection step to have meaningful implementation security. And next for the advanced signature part, I think pursuing this work that we've been doing on SEP is very important because it can lead to optimizations in all of these subsequent primitives. There might be optimizations in specific constructions like blind and group signatures, which we are also currently working on. But I think the bottleneck is proving lattice relations in zero knowledge. We've seen that the signature size was quite small, but the proof size was still a little bit too big compared to current systems. So it seems to me that proving lattice relations using the same framework that we've been using is approaching kind of a barrier. So finding new ways of proving lattice relations in zero knowledge could be an efficiency, could lead to an efficiency gain in those signatures for privacy. And finally, for the implementation part, The next step will be to implement those zero-knowledge proof optimizations that I talked about, the ones that got us to 61 kilobytes, and also optimize the implementation itself, which we so far only provided as a proof of concept. And although it led to interesting timings already, I think it can be reduced much further. And this is all that I wanted to present today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So now we'll move on to the questions from the committee. So we'll start with Vadim, if you can hear us.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the talk, Corentin. So I have just a few maybe technical questions about the talk. So on slide 14, if you could go down.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that's it. I guess I'm a little curious. I think I see the answer, but I'm still not understanding why that's true. That you don't do rejection sampling on E. So even though E is implicit, you never do rejection sampling on it. Whereas in other schemes, that use rejection sampling, whenever there's some part that's implicit and be recomputed, you'd still have to do something there, like the Galbraith scheme, for example. What is the intuition here?
The intuition is essentially we can draw a little bit of a parallel between this sampler and the Fiat chamber with a board scheme. And in that case, actually AP1 or U minus AP1 to be exact, can actually be revealed without leading to a security issue here. So this could be seen as kind of the commitment in those identification schemes.
Sorry, what do you mean, the commitment? What is U minus AP1 in
So U is the syndrome we invert here.
Yeah.
So the error is essentially the low order components of U minus AP1. And we get V2, which is the high order components. So in theory, we can recover U minus AP1. But U minus AP1 can actually be made public without incurring security issues.
So why is that? So that's my question.
The answer is because U minus AP1 is statistically uniform based on our previous requirement. And by having U to be the hash of the message here, we can actually make sure that this term does not leak any information on P1 without using rejection sampling, say by reprogramming the random oracle in a way that we can then prove that the distribution does not depend on any secret data.
Okay. So it's the random oracle that makes it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. In the context of Phoenix, yes.
Makes it different. Okay, thanks. And one more, I guess, whatever, slide 15 or whatever, whenever you talked about the public key compression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here.
So you mentioned that. So you don't need any hints or anything else like that for public key compression.
Yeah.
So technically, for example, if you could do public key compression in lithium also without hints, but then you wouldn't get to do as much. So the point of hints is you can kind of push beyond what you can do without, with what you can do without hints. So just one extra bit allows you to maybe drop whatever, allows us to drop 10 more bits of the public key. So isn't there a chance that you could also get some hints there, and then you can compress the key even more, or can you give an intuition for why this doesn't work?
So I haven't considered hints on this aspect, on this perspective. I was mostly referring to the hints that we have, say, in the lithium or Hete, where the hints are there because we essentially hash the public key to get the message. So if the public key is compressed, we also need these hints, which are kind of carries between the low order and high order components to recover the correct thing in the end. So these were the hints I was talking about, and the rejection sampling as well to maintain correctness and security. But I haven't looked at, for example, the LWE assumption with hints that could maybe improve a little bit on this approach of key compression.
Oh, so I was talking about the same hints you were talking about. So not LWE with hints, but exactly what you were saying. So
Okay.
usually hints, they allowed us to get a lot more compression, not for free, but for hints. But when you
Yeah.
average it out, so what I mean by avoiding hints, are you not kind of leaving some bits on the table, or can you give me some intuition for why you cannot just give those carries as hints and then you can compress a lot more? The carries you meant.
This is an interesting question, and I don't think I have the answer to that. We haven't looked at it too much. It was mostly this comparison was mostly to the case that for correctness of the scheme, we actually don't need to provide those carries, and yeah, this is the main argument that I wanted to convey. But I think it could also be an interesting optimization to keep reducing the public key using hints, but I haven't looked at it yet.
Yeah, because my intuition was that in dilithium you could also not give hints, but then you can only compress it a little bit. So maybe the same thing could apply for you.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, and yeah, I mean, I'll leave the questions to others. Maybe if I have one later, I can come back.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Vadim. So we continue with Olivier.
Okay, so first, thank you for the presentation. It was very clear and really echoed your manuscript. You managed to cover a lot of content about lattices, and you give good intuition about the idea of your construction. So I have two questions. One on the slide 16. When you present the various signatures, the evolution of size is both the key and the signature are getting smaller or bigger, and it's happening at the same time. Would there be a way to optimize it, like let the public key be a little bit bigger but gain a lot of signature, or is it really inherent to the construction that they are always going to evolve at the same time?
I think at least from the lattice approach, you could very well have larger public keys for maybe smaller signatures. For example, if we use Phoenix and don't use key compression, it means that we don't increase this V11. So in our case, the compression comes almost for free, so we don't have to take into account this. But it could also reduce the size of V11, which would reduce the signature size. Now, there are other design framework for post-quantum cryptography that have different trade-offs between the key size and the signature size, some of which have very small signatures but large public keys, and others that have larger public keys but no, the other way around, smaller public keys but large signatures. It can be interesting in different use cases. And yeah, I wanted to mention something else, but I don't remember.
Okay, thank you.
Oh yeah, so, sorry. The one thing that I wanted to mention is that in this context, all of these schemes are based on actually structured lattices, so on the module part. And in non-structured lattices, you would have a public key that is more in kilobytes here, and signature that is roughly the same size. But you have maybe stronger security guarantees, so it could also be a trade-off between efficiency and security, at least on the public key size. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And in your perspective slide, so on slide 26, but
yes,
it's not, you say that you are still looking at further optimization, for example, in the case of a group and blind signature.
Yes.
Classical trick on elliptic curve crypto for blind signature, for example, is to drop the extra zero knowledge proof altogether by just being able to randomize the signature.
Yes.
Would that be conceivable, possible on lattices, or is it like impossible because you use a hash inside and kind of approach?
So for these signatures for privacy, we are not using hashes. So potentially, it at least would not be prevented by hash functions. But this is a very interesting way. This is a very interesting research direction because the proof size is what makes the scheme less efficient. So if we could avoid it altogether, it could lead to more efficient schemes. Now, I don't have an idea on how to do it on lattices. I wouldn't say there is an impossibility result, but I'm also out of ideas to do this. But this would be an interesting research direction, in my opinion. Yes.
And just one last question. So right now, Europe is considering trying to standardize approach for digital identity and stuff like that. And one of the main points against academic cryptography is the lack of standard and the difficulty to implement it on hardware and get efficiency. So for lattices, do you have any idea where it is right now? Because NIST is starting to standardize stuff, but would there be target sizes that you would need to for implementations so that they are really practical and can be efficient concurrent to classical signature?
So classical signatures, especially signatures for privacy, are very efficient. There is a very small overhead compared to the standard signatures. And they're about, I think, 200 bytes for anonymous credentials. So we're far above this size. I don't think we can match this size, but we might be able to improve the size much further. Now, as you mentioned, I think that one other key factor is also implementation. And the implementation of the zero knowledge proofs that we use is fairly involved, fairly complex. So I don't see it, at least at the moment, I don't see it implemented in small chips or something with very low computing power. And this is why looking at ways of getting rid of these zero knowledge proofs everywhere possible, say using reductible signatures or randomizable signatures, stuff like that, could be very, very important. Now, in terms of standardization, I would say that for the first call of post-quantum cryptography, there was maybe an incentive towards sizes and very efficient schemes. And now we're kind of shifting towards those implementation security issues, implementation complexity. And this is also maybe one of the reasons why that Falcon is, the Falcon standard is also still lagging a little bit behind the Kyber and the Lithium standards, which are easier to implement. So I think the problem here for signatures for privacy in implementation will be the zero knowledge proofs. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivier. So now, Alice, if you have questions.
Yes, I had a question on your approximate rejection sampler, I think, on slide 16. And you say one of the features is that you can have variety of distribution with this sampler. And so you mentioned also like uniform in cube. And I think in the manuscript you say it might be interesting because it's easier to implement, but it would give you larger signature size. And do you think there could be some perfect distribution that is simple to implement and with short vectors? Or
so I'm actually actively looking into it. I've discussed with a few other researchers about this, and for example, I think it's in the on-ramp signature Raccoon, where they use a similar approach for Fiat Shamir with the board signatures, and they use a distribution which is a sum of uniform and a sum of a small number of uniform. So this gives you a shape of a Gaussian, which would keep the same kind of level of compactness that we expect from Phoenix or other signatures, but by only relying on uniform distributions, which are easy to sample, and also for the rejection step, being without relying on floating points or things like that, which are terrible for implementation security. So there's some of uniform option. I'm also looking into using binomial distributions, which mimic the shape of a Gaussian much better than a sum of uniform, but they are also easy to sample because they're just sampling random bits. But the key blockage at the moment is the rejection step. It doesn't require floats, but it's slightly more involved than just a check for uniform distribution.
Okay, another question. On something we didn't talk about, like on the foundation. I was more interested also in this part. So you have proven that modular WE with small secret and small error can be reduced from modular W with more standard parameters.
Yes.
Do you think you could get some kind of similar result for untrue also? Or is there some people looking at it? I'm not aware of any.
I'm not aware either of people looking at it. We have been using the untrue assumption, but as a starting point, not as the end point. We provided, for example, the MLWE harness with entropic secrets was based on a module version of untrue. But I haven't looked at reductions for untrue. There have been works to already link it to standard lattice problems by you and co-authors, but I haven't looked at the hardness of untrue in different parameter regimes. I think untrue is much trickier because of these overstretched parameter regimes, which you have to be aware of when you're doing cryptanalysis, scheme designs, but also reductions, I think.
Okay, thanks. I'm good.
Okay, thanks, Alice. So I will ask my questions before the team of advisors. So I have a few questions on the signatures with efficient protocols. So yeah, this slide is nice. So yeah, you mentioned in your efficiency slide the size of the signature and of the final proof, but you do not say much about the communication complexity for this issuance protocol. So how?
Okay. So in the issuance protocol, we have to send a zero-knowledge proof and a commitment. The commitment is fairly succinct because it compresses the message and the randomness into something of fixed size. And the zero-knowledge proof is actually smaller than the zero-knowledge proof for the authentication protocol because the relation we have to prove is much simpler. And in the end, I don't have the concrete numbers, but I think we're neighboring 100 kilobytes in total. And that includes also the second part of this communication transcript, which is the signature site.
Yeah,
so commitment plus proof plus signature is roughly 100 kilobytes, I would say.
Thank you. And you mentioned that the second proof when you want is more complex. What are the kind of circuits that you consider?
So we essentially have to prove the verification equation of the signature, and let me just go back on what the verification equation looks like. It looks like this, and we here have to hide all of the terms corresponding to the signature, so the tag and this vector v tilde, and the message, which corresponds to our personal information.
Yeah, but if you want to hide some information from the message, say you just want to reveal your age or something,
so
if you have some...
You can actually have selective disclosure by essentially splitting this DM term into some D1 M hidden and D2 M disclosed. And so the M disclosed would be public, and you can recompute. You can actually merge it with U, for example, and you only have to hide this D1 M hidden term. So you can actually disclose a little bit as you want the attributes of the system without having to change much in the proof system. And in our case, all of the sizes and timings that I've given was for hiding the entire message to be in the most pessimistic case, actually. But the proof sizes would be a little bit smaller if you disclose some part of the message, and it would also probably be a little bit faster.
And is it possible to handle more complex policies, not just partial disclosure, if you want to, I don't know, some attributes, some conjunctions of attributes?
Yes, so there are a few things we can do because this system is very algebraic. We can, for example, prove range proofs to say prove that you're above 18. You could use range proofs to do so within the proof system. It allows us to do so. We didn't implement it yet, but you could do so, and I would think that it would be rather compact with a very small overhead by using some kind of 4-square decomposition to prove that you're in a certain interval. And I haven't looked at very complex statement. This is also something I want to look at in the future to be able to match the requirements of the industry and concrete use cases of those anonymous credential system to be able to prove meaningful things on the attributes themselves. Yes.
And in your conclusion, you mentioned NPC in the head for techniques to achieve this. Do you have any ideas what you can achieve or hope for?
So I discussed with people that are working on NPC in the head. I haven't looked at it too much also, but from what I understand, MPC in the head is essentially a paradigm to design zero-knowledge proofs from a family of assumptions. So if you plug, say, a code assumption, you're going to have a code proof system, a code-based proof system, same thing for lattices and so on. And it seems that if you're based on lattice assumption, it's less efficient than, say, on code. So I'm not sure if it could lead to improvements using lattice relations. I'm hoping so, but I haven't looked at it just yet. This is on my to-do list.
The kind of proofs that you are using are Schnorr-based.
Exactly.
Or like proofs in the lattice
The
setting.
proof we're using is from the framework of Lubishevsky and Nguyen-Plançon from Crypto 2022, with some optimizations here and there. But this is just not a Sigma protocol because it's 5 rounds, but its size, the zero-knowledge proof size, is essentially linear in the vector you want to prove knowledge of. And in particular, so there is a very small unit cost, which means that this linear dependency is not so damaging in practice. We can have 60 kilobytes proof without too much effort. But those MPC in the heads proof are usually sublinear in the dimension of the vector you want to prove knowledge of, which would be more interesting if we have, say, anonymous credentials with a large number of attributes to hide, but the unit cost is also a little bit larger. So there is kind of a trade-off on how many things you want to hide and which proof system to use. Yes.
Thank you. So now we'll move on to the advisors. I will follow the order on the thesis. So Pierre-Alain.
Okay. Thank you very much, Damien and Corentin. So I was not main supervisor, but I was happy to have Aline and Olivier, and I would like to thank them for all the work that they did. And also I would like to thank you for all the work that you did, because I think it's quite impressive. And I have just one question is about the times that you have. So less than half a second is impressive, but what could you expect, in fact? How much you can go lower?
So, for example, if we take classical anonymous credentials, which are implemented, there have been prototypes at Orange, for example, which proves that the timings on the smartphone could be like a few milliseconds. So in classical groups, you can have a few milliseconds. Lattices have shown that they could be that they could beat classical constructions. So we might expect less, although with slightly larger sizes. Now, as I said, this implementation is really a proof of concept. And one of the details that makes those timings a little bit not as small as I would have wanted is because we're relying on a library called Flint, which allocates objects in the heap, which takes much longer than if they're allocated in the stack. So by having optimizations already on the implementation, having a dedicated parameter backend, for example, I think we could get to a few milliseconds, or maybe a few tens of milliseconds for each steps.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I will not ask you any question, Corentin, but I want to congratulate you for your PhD. I agree with Pierre-Alain. It's a very impressive work, and I'm very happy that you did it with us. It was very nice 4 years for me
Yeah.
because we met each other 4 years ago, and so I think you can be very proud of yourself, of your work. And again, I'm very happy to see the researcher you became during those 4 years. So, congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Olivier.
Yes, thank you, Corentin, for the presentation. Thank you for the last 3 years. I've asked a lot of questions during these last 3 years, so I don't have anything left for today. So I spare you this. So again, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So Vadim, if you have further questions, we can ask them now.
Oh, it's okay. Everyone else said they
Okay.
don't.
Okay.
It's questions. Yeah, it's fine.
So it's okay. So
Vadim, I've sent you an email with the link for the jury meeting.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay, so we are going to connect.
donc on se retire pour délibérer. Je ne sais pas si on revient là.
Je crois qu'on revient là.
On revient là. On revient.
Voilà.
On revient ici.
Voilà, donc nous avons délibéré. Donc je vais lire le rapport que nous avons écrit. Donc, Corentin, tu as donné une présentation très claire et synthétique de ton travail de thèse sur la conception de signatures numériques avancées offrant une sécurité post-quantique. Tu as utilisé les supports de grande qualité dans un exposé dynamique et pédagogique présentant une sélection de tes nombreuses contributions. Nous avons été particulièrement impressionnés par la variété remarquable de tes travaux en cryptographie fondés sur les réseaux euclidiens, allant de l'étude des fondations mathématiques de la sécurité de ces primitives à des constructions de signatures avancées et jusqu'à leur implémentation efficace. Lors de nos nombreuses questions, tu as démontré ta profonde maîtrise du sujet au-delà de ton domaine, ainsi qu'un grand recul sur les résultats obtenus et les pistes de recherche futures. Et pour toutes ces raisons, nous sommes persuadés que tu feras un excellent chercheur ou enseignant-chercheur, et en conséquence, nous te décernons le titre de docteur de l'Université de Rennes dans la spécialité informatique.